people, when they first try cider, they might try mass-produced stuff, you know, and they don't quite get what the real thing's all about. And people will often have a bad experience with cider at first, because they'll drink like White Lightning or Strongbow or something, and it will put them off for life. But the real thing is amazing, and it's the purest drink there is, you know. Proper cider is 100% apple juice and absolutely nothing else, like no additives whatsoever, no chemicals. There's a slightly anarchic aspect to cider drinking and cider making, and every aspect of its production and the selling of cider, which I like. It has a slightly outlaw aspect, which I really like. I mean, when I say cider, what I'm really talking about is West Country Scrumpy. I'm talking about cider specifically cider from Somerset, because that, in my opinion, that's the best cider in the world. And yeah, I mean, I used to write for Cameras magazine, the beer, and go around the country, you know, doing little features on cider makers, and I've got to know a few of them, and they're a really interesting bunch of people. You know, there's lots of quite eccentric people gravitate towards cider making. So yeah,
it's interesting you talk about a purity in the cider, because there's also a scrumpy as well. And I remember, in fact, I remember it was Massive Attack who told me about 30 years ago, there was pubs in Bristol where they kept the vats of the scrumpy in the cellar, and they would chuck like old mice in it, dead birds. I mean, I know that's kind of a myth, but maybe it's not. Maybe you could dispel or enhance that myth.
Well, that is a myth I've heard as well. I don't know. I couldn't comment on the pub in Bristol. I know that in the old days, rats would end up in vats of cider because they're out in the barn, and the vats are very often open, you know. So you're out on a farm, you're going to get rats, and they will sometimes end up there. There have been strange, you know, tales about cider makers putting interesting things into cider in order to increase its body. I mean, I used to make cider with a mate, and his grandfather made cider in Herefordshire, and we found his old cider making logbook, and it said lay a piece of lead piping into the vat, you know, so that was kind of strange. So, you know, people did put strange things in cider. There's a great book called Food in England. I forget who wrote it. It was written in the 1950s, and there's a whole section on cider making. And the lady who wrote it talks about cider makers in Cornwall putting sheep's blood into the vat to increase body. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility. I mean, I'd be amazed if any modern cider maker chucked rats in these days, but you know, but it's in the cellar. Rats are there. They could end up in there. It's possible, you know, but it's just a lovely thing to do. I mean, I've made cider over the years, and it's not in any great quantity, but just kind of 20-30 gallons for the Cambridge Beer Festival, and it's just a nice thing to do. You know, you're outside all day, and you know, picking up the apples, scratching the apples, and it's a nice way to spend the time. You know, you feel quite connected to the trees and, you know, to the land when you're doing it. So
what's the history of it? Is it like the oldest alcoholic drink, or is it? I mean, I'm sure that's quite blurred, quite literally now in historical terms.
It's certainly one of them in this country. I mean, because it's so easy to make. It's not like beer where you've got to have a few ingredients. With cider, you've just got the apples, and providing you've got apples, you can go and make some cider, you know. I think cider making in Britain goes back to pre-Roman times. I don't know. I wouldn't like to say if it's old. I don't know if it's older than wine. In the Latin countries, I would have thought their wine culture goes back just as long as our cider culture. But we've been doing it for millennia. And it pretty much every area in the country used to make cider. I mean, where I am in East Anglia, we still make cider here, but not in any great quantity. And it's not, the cider we make here is slightly different to West Country cider. It's made with eating apples and cooking apples. Historically in East Anglia, we use any kind of apple that we have, and that results in a slightly sweeter cider. Whereas in the West Country, in Somerset, they will only use cider apples, which are really astringent apples, and they've got a load of tannin, you know, and that's what I like. But it can be a bit, if you're not used to it, it can be slightly foreboding if you just start on like a really dry West Country cider. It can be quite full on, you know.
So are there like historical references? Is there like a druidic cider crossover from 500 BC or something?
There's certainly that aspect to it. I mean, there's something that still happens every year in the orchards in the West Country and orchards all over the country. Is there's a tradition in January called waysailing, which is where you go into the orchard and you bless the trees. And this is a pagan ceremony. It predates Christian practice, and you go out into the orchards and you make a load of noise. And traditionally, you might bring a saucepan or a drum, or you know, you'll sing songs. And the idea is that you try to firstly bless the trees for a good harvest the next year, and also to kind of beat out any evil spirits in the orchard. So it's a really cool tradition actually. And if you go to a big cider farm like Wilkins or any of the big ones in Somerset or Herefordshire, you know, it'll be quite a big party. There might be a few hundred people there. So it's just a big piss up really, you know, of music and stuff. But the tradition is very much it's rooted in pagan times. So yeah.
So are there a lot of references in in mummer plays or like old English stories and folk tales to cider?
I think there probably will be. I can't think of any offhand, but I think there's definitely, you know, cider drinking. It's like it's goes back centuries. So I'm sure there will be. I mean, that's one of the things I like about it, is that when you drink a pint of Wilkins cider. Wilkins is my favourite producer. He's in Wedmore, just on the edge of the Somerset Levels. And when you drink his cider, you're drinking something that hasn't changed for centuries. I mean, it's you know, he's using ancient orchards. There's no other ingredients. Nothing else goes into the cider. You know, so it's like it's a piece of the past, really. You know, in a real sense. It's very different to, you know, a lot of beer these days, or a lot of wine that you're going to be drinking is going to be a wildly different product to something of 100, 200, 300 years ago. With cider, it's pretty much unchanged, you know.
Because it will be the same trees, because apple trees live for like hundreds of years, don't they?
They do, exactly. So, and it's just there's a feeling of elation, I think, that comes from cider that you don't get from any other drink. I think it's partly because when you drink beer, hops are soporific, you know, you get that tiredness, and wine can be quite I don't know, wine can be quite a depressive kind of drink if you overdo red wine, you know. Do you ever get that on red wine, you know, got kind of feeling of
well, this is quite ironic. I don't drink, but
okay, yeah, but
just
it's a common yeah, no, probably for the bed. But,
that's where I get my tannin from. Yeah.
but I think cider's I think cider's quite unique in its effect, in that there's a lot of sugar in it. There's a lot of natural sugar in it. So the feeling you get from cider is quite a feeling of uplift and a feeling of elation, you know, which is quite it's different to beer or wine, you know.
It's interesting. Yeah. I like this idea that old trees, because I remember interviewing Shirley Collins, the folk singer, and she talks about the folk songs of England come out of the soil of England. And I'm getting this little thing in my head now where the cider's coming out the same soil, and it's entwining with the folk songs, and it's
absolutely. Yeah, there's a definite connection between cider and folk music. That it's quite big on the folk scene. Like I was saying, I mean, I used to go to the Cambridge Folk Festival quite regularly. Not because I'm a huge folk fan. I do like folk music, but I'm not a massive folky or anything. But in Cambridge, you know, if you're from Cambridge, you end up going down there, and it's had quite a kind of broad spectrum of music. You'd have like Joe Strummer when he was alive, obviously, and the Levellers and people like that. It wasn't just acoustic folk, but there was a great cider bar, and they used to do mulled cider there as well, which is lovely. I don't know if you've ever seen mulled cider, but it's kind of hot spice cider. It's really nice.
What spices do they put in that? Is it cardamom or?
It's cardamom and mace and cinnamon and a fair bit of sugar. It's a nice drink. Really nice.
That must be a very old drink as well.
Yeah, I should think so. There was a big tradition, particularly in Victorian times, of mulling, you know, mulling wine and beer and making various punches and cups and things. I've got a few old cookbooks, and they very often make reference to the process of mulling and spicing. It was whether or not that was to do with covering up, drink which was slightly past its best.
The dead rats, the
exactly.
lumps of lead.
Flavour of rat. Yeah.
So is there a sense, in a way, that when the Romans came and they brought their newfangled wine with them, that there'll be like, the Roman towns and villas, they'd be drinking their wine, and the British peasants would be on the outside with their cider?
There's absolutely that. And I mean, cider historically has been seen as very much a working class, working man's drink. And if you look at some of the history in Somerset in the 17th, 18th, into the 19th century, there was a lot of people were worried that the illicit trade was springing up by the roadsides and by the farms, and there were cider houses, and there still are cider houses. They're slightly different to pubs in that it will generally be a shed at the back of a farm where people congregate and drink cider, and it won't necessarily be taxed. It will all be cash in hand. To this day, it's still, if you go to Dorset or Somerset, a lot of the cider trade will be at the farm gates. There'll be a little sign saying honk for cider, and you turn up and you go and buy your cider, and that's it. And it's the same, and it was the same in the 19th century, 18th century. There was a lot of people were worried that it was a bad influence, essentially. So it was very much seen as a rural, agricultural, rough drink. And actually, there's in Somerset particularly, people would be paid in cider. Farm labourers would go from farm to farm, and they'd be given a quota of cider, in lieu of pay, and they'd get to know which farms produced decent cider. And in the summer, they'd do the circuit, as it were. So it would be known that a certain farm would produce particularly decent cider, and that would be popular with itinerant labourers. So farmers would put jugs of cider on either side of a field, and people would work as fast as they could to get to the cider. So it's very much, an agricultural, Roger Wilkins, he's an amazing cider maker. He describes it as agricultural lubricant, which is just probably the best description of cider.
It's interesting as well, because it gives you a sense of the older geography of Britain, which it's because Britain was always built in the south, really, the old Britain. Because up here, there was hardly anybody up here then. We don't really have a cider tradition up here, whereas this is very southwest, bit of East Anglia. Yeah, they're kind of the epicenters of it. And where?
That's right. Kent's got a cider tradition as well, because of course they grow a lot of fruit there. But it's really the West Country, and and when I say the West Country, it's really Somerset and Herefordshire that have got the most developed cider tradition. They do make cider in Devon, they do make it in Dorset, they make it in Cornwall, but not to the level of Somerset and Herefordshire. But even now, there's a bit of a divide really between Somerset cider and Hereford cider. Hereford was traditionally the place that the industry took off. So you've got people like Westons based in Herefordshire. You've got some of the big cider makers there. That was where it took off as an actual industry, as opposed to a kind of farm gates, working man's drink. It took off as a proper industry in Herefordshire, and even today, it's slightly more refined. The producers up there it's a slightly more refined, slightly less rough take on cider. So there's a guy called Tom Oliver. He makes a really his cider is amazing, but it's quite far removed from the agricultural scrumpy. He makes a lot of perry as well. In Herefordshire, they make a lot of perry, which is made with pears. It's a bit these days. People talk about pear cider. There's actually no such thing. Perry is made from pears. Cider is made from apples. So when people talk about blackcurrant cider or strawberry cider, there's no such thing. That's really, that's a kind of mass-produced alco pop. Cider's got to be made from apples. But perry's a lovely drink, and it's dying out. There's hardly any decent perry producers, and one of the reasons for that is that perry trees take hundreds of years to to grow. They're enormous when they're at full bloom, but they're very difficult to grow, and there's not many of them. It's mainly Herefordshire and Gloucestershire. It's not an easy drink to produce, so, but it's really nice if you get the chance to drink it. We don't make any perry in East Anglia at all. But
is it got an equivalent smaller history then to cider making, or is it a different history?
It's a slightly different history in that historically perry was seen as being upmarket and cider was seen as being downmarket. So farmers might produce perry, but they might bottle perry, whereas cider would just be, you know, from the wood. It wouldn't necessarily be bottled, whereas perry would be put into decent bottles and, you know, might be put on the dinner table for a special occasion, you know. So it was seen as being more akin to wine, really.
When I was touring a lot in the 80s, I was always very surprised because I always thought cider was such a quintessentially English drink, but going to places like Germany or to the USA, it's actually quite common there as well. Yeah,
it is. Apfelwein of Hamburg. Is it? I think it's Hamburg. They drink a lot of it there. Yeah, and in Spain, they've got a very well developed cider industry around the Basque Country, and it's almost as old as ours. Actually, there's the Spanish cider's the most similar cider that you'll find to West Country cider. It's quite astringent, you know. It's quite sour. It's around 6-7%. It's quite a similar drink, but they pour it from really, really up high. I don't know if have you ever seen Spanish cider being poured? It's like you drink it in like almost like a shot. So the barman will open it and pour it, and it will give the drink a bit of effervescence. You know, it's nice. It's a different culture, but it's a nice drink.
Is there like a crossover in histories, or is it just because everyone had apple trees, inevitably they're going to make an apple drink?
Exactly, they just had their apples that, you know, and it's they've been doing it for almost as long as we have, but it's a slightly different culture though. In Spain, it tends to go with the food. So if you go to a cider house in Spain, you tend to be served a very particular meal, which is salt cod omelette to start with, and then a steak, and throughout the meal you'll be able to go up to the barrels. They open the barrel, the cider pours out of the barrel, and you stand there with your glass and you catch it. I've not actually been. I've only seen it on YouTube. It looks amazing. I'd like to go one day. It's mainly focused around the Basque Country, but it's basically you have your salt cod omelette, your steak, and your cider, and that's the way they do it there. You know, it's very much a social thing. So, but in terms of a cider tradition in our country, it's you know, the cider house is dying out really. There's not that many pubs left that specialize in cider, because traditionally a cider house was somewhere that didn't serve any beer at all. You know, it was somewhere that would only serve cider, and there's not that many left. There's one in Devon, in Taunton. I think there's a few in Bristol. There's not many left. I think people's tastes are changing as well, because if you look at the cider that sells a lot in the UK, it tends to be fairly sweet, fizzy cider like Magners, you know, which is served over ice. So it's a very different product to traditional scrumpy, you know.
It's interesting because I thought we'd be having a revival now, because, you know, there's all that because of people making like small localized beers and things, and seems to be a trend going that direction. So has that not really happened in the cider scene?
Well, there has been a little bit, but I think it's more. But I think in terms of the cider I'm interested in, which is the real scrumpy, it's quite a difficult drink to market, you know, because it does have that reputation as being quite a strong, astringent drink, you know, that takes a little bit of getting used to. But there's definitely been a big boom in cider making, but it tends to be more akin to the craft beer scene. So it's more, you know, people carbonating their cider, people sweetening their cider, people putting it into cans, you know, which is a different culture really. I think it's, you know, it's fair enough if that's what people are into. It's personally, it's not really to my taste, so it's not a world I'm involved in, but it's a different side to cider really. But it's definitely taken off.
Yeah. Is there any kind of traditions that people do when they drink in a pure kind of cider house? You know, is it Do you wear certain things? Is there certain things that people shout at each other? Is there a culture built around it? Is it like a Japanese tea making ceremony?
No, there's the place I'd advise anyone to go is Wilkins Cider Farm, which is just amazing. It's in just outside Wedmore, and basically he's been making cider since he was about 12. He's been drinking cider since the age of 5. He's extraordinary. He's this Somerset farmer basically, and he's been making cider pretty much the same way his entire life. He does everything by taste. He doesn't measure pH or anything. He just, as he's making it, he's tasting it, and he does it all by sight and all by taste. And there's a barn at the back of his farm which nothing has changed there. It's like cobwebs, really dusty, because it's almost like a Belgian lambic producer. He doesn't want to mess up the wild yeast. You know, if you muck around with the environment too much, the end product may change. You know, so it's an amazing environment though. It's like stepping back into the past really. And a few people from the punk world have paid Wilkins a visit. John Lydon used to turn up now and again, and Joe Strummer lived in Somerset and apparently was a regular visitor. But I don't know how long it's going to be there, so I'd advise anyone to go while they can, because he's in his mid-70s now, and I don't know if his sons are going to take over. I hope they do, but if they don't, it would be a real shame, because it would, if his sons don't take over, then it will go with him. So it's well worth a look. Yeah.
And finally, do you remember lager Snakebites, which was like cider and lager mixed together?
As I was saying, I went to university in Hull, and that was a very popular drink in the early noughties. Snakebite Black, which was just, Strongbow mixed with lager with a bit of blackcurrant cordial. And it was really grim. It was kind of incredibly sweet. And there was always rumours that certain pubs wouldn't like to serve it, you know, because it caused
violence.
Or the idea that it caused a kind of chemical reaction. The lager and the cider didn't mix together. I don't like it personally, but it was a big thing, wasn't it? It was quite big in the goth scene as well, wasn't it? I think
big with goths and psychobillies, and then there's always permutations of it. You could put Pernod in it as well, a dash of Pernod.
Oh God, no!
And the one that was really hideous was called the Swamp, which is all that mixed together with a straw, blue cigarette smoke down the bottom, and it would bubble up and come out the top like a little cloud of smoke. Wow. And it would get you drunk really fast, but it also give you the most rancid headache of all time.
Yeah, that sounds grim. There was this place in Hull, you might have been actually, called Spiders, which is like a really kind of legendary goth club, and it's like in the middle of an industrial estate in the middle of nowhere, and they'd sell a lot of Snakebite Black, and they do these really bizarre cocktails, which would be like £1.50, £2, and it's just, the whole place smelt of Pernod. I can still remember the smell. I hope it's still there. I wonder if it is still there.
Yeah, it's one of the longest running nightclubs in Britain now, apparently.
I'd like, it's a shame actually. I haven't made cider for a few years, because the guy that I make cider with, or that I used to make cider with, went to join the Royal Navy. He's now a chef in the Navy, and his mum and dad had some proper Somerset cider apple trees, and so the cider we were making was very much a kind of East Anglian version of a West Country cider, and it wasn't bad. You know, we had like a Kingston Black tree, a Yarlington Mill, and a Somerset Red Streak, and the amount that comes off these trees, they're huge trees, and we'd make 50 gallons, and if we had time, we probably could have made triple that. You know, it's amazing how big these trees actually are. So it's a nice time to spend. It's a nice way to spend the time. And I miss it. I miss that thing of just being able to go outside and spend a day gathering apples, and spend some time at the press. It's a nice way of spending time. It'd be nice to do it again. I'd like to do it again at some point. I have this kind of fantasy of, when I'm 60 or 70, being able to, just do that for a few years. It's great. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but
they've actually, in Manchester in the centre, they planted the first orchard for a couple 100 years right in the centre in this kind of new building it, and they made their own cider for it as well, and Coates cider.
There's a lot of that in terms of community orchards. It's really nice. There's one near me in a place called Histon, and there's one in Wandlebury. Wandlebury's this kind of old Iron Age settlement near Cambridge, and they've got well, I say Iron Age settlement. There's no one there now. It's just a load of hills. But you know, it's, there's a nice orchard there. It's a really nice idea, and anyone can just go and pick the fruits. You know, it'd be nice to do a cider with that actually one day. It'd be good. But that's the other thing about cider making, is that it's so labour intensive. In order to make a gallon of cider, you're going to be out there picking apples for, if there's 2 of you, you'll be out there probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours. You know, it's not much juice comes out of a cider apple. A Kingston Black is like a really small little apple, and it's not, you don't get a great yield, you know. So you've really got to have a lot of apples. So it's a labour intensive activity, you know. It's not like making beer where you just get the hops and pour the water on. With cider, it's because you're not using any water, you've just got to have as many apples as you know, as many apples as you've got, and then you've got to press them, and it's labour intensive. It's quite a physical activity, you know. So
no wonder it's struggling now, where everyone's too lazy.
yeah, exactly. Oh, that's it. Because even if you've got a fairly big setup, like even the relatively big producers in Somerset, they've still got to go out there and collect all the apples. You know, there's so much of it is done manually. You know, so that's it. Yeah. But it's a you know, it would be a shame if it died. And I think there's enough of an underground kind of enthusiast scene with cider. You know, if you go to any beer festival that Camera put on, the cider bar is always really popular, you know. So I think people do like it, and people do get to know it, you know, from the festivals and from, you know, God knows how many pints of cider they must sell at Glastonbury every year, but the cider bus is always absolutely heaving. And I think so many people's first experience of cider is from going up to the cider bus, you know. So it's a kind of cultural landmark really at Glastonbury, and it has been, I don't know how long he's been doing it. He's been doing it for way longer than I've been going. Yeah, probably has actually. He probably has been doing it almost since the beginning. I wouldn't be surprised. I must find out actually. He's an interesting guy, Julian Temple. He's got a kind of slightly aristocratic kind of bearing about him, you know. He's quite a kind of he's like, yeah, he makes cider brandy as well, which is a nice drink. That's similar to Calvados, but made with Somerset cider apples. It's lovely. So it's a nice farm. Yeah.
Did you ever hear about the cider punks in Bristol?
The cider? No, I don't think so. Was that like a kind of adjacent to the Brew Crew, kind of a Bristol version?
Probably an earlier version in a sense, but it was the 1979-80 punks, and it's a big thing in Bristol to drink cider. It's very culty. And all the bands in Bristol, like Disorder and all those kind of post-discharge D-beats, Bristol bands, it was part of their whole thing. And they're always called the cider punks, and they always used to sit out in the parks with their cider. And in the early days of, you know, having a dog on a string, it was like it's like a proto version of that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I mean that's the thing, is a lot of people do associate it with street drinking, and I think this is quite an important point. It's like it does have that reputation, but the real thing, and probably the stuff that they were drinking, if they were in Bristol, they were probably drinking quite decent cider, I would have thought. And I would like to make the point that it's actually quite good for you if you don't overdo it, because there's no additives. It's just apple juice, and it's packed full of vitamin C. Loads of cider makers live really long lives, you know. They'll live to 90, 100. You know, it's just, they're outdoors drinking cider, and it's actually quite, providing you don't overdo it. I don't want to say, oh, you know, go out and drink, you know,
have a bath in it.
You know, but I think in comparison to a lot of drinks, it's a relatively healthy